What's up, everybody? It's Tony Lopez here with Alternative Living Spaces. Thank you for tuning in and continuing in this build series that we have going on. Today, we're going to be talking about plumbing, specifically rough plumbing. So for those of you that have been along for the journey, thank you for the time investment you've made. And it really is our mission to help you succeed in building your own shipping container home. We started building container homes back in 2016. Since then, we've built over 100 shipping container homes. We've done offices, gyms, a bunch of different things like that, and have learned a lot of lessons, and some of them the hard way. And so it's our goal to help teach you from some of the things that we had to learn the hard way, help you avoid those costly mistakes, and ultimately give you a roadmap and a guide for each stage of the build process so that you can successfully build out your container home. A couple things just before we dive right in. I do want to encourage you, if you have not checked out our free video training that we put together, you can find the link in the description below. In that training, we cover a lot of really important topics. So for those of you that are serious about building a container home, that you are genuinely interested in moving forward with a project like this, you're definitely going to want to watch that video. A lot of helpful just tips and things that we've learned that I know will add a ton of value to you. So like I said, that will be found in the description below. Feel free to check that out whenever you have the chance. Now jumping right into plumbing. This goes over a little bit of an overview of the things we're going to be discussing today. So we'll be discussing mapping out your plumbing, running your drain and your vent lines, running your water lines, going over some finishing details, which is really just those small details as you're doing your plumbing, things you don't want to miss. And then finally, how do you test your plumbing to make sure it is done well? You may have a subcontractor or someone do your plumbing, and you just want to make sure it's done right. So before we get into all those steps, we will kind of go through just some introductory stuff here as well. First off, is just going over some of the key supplies. So as you can see here in the image, top left, you have ABS lines. These are going to be what you're going to use for your drain lines. Most common, you have 3-inch size, which is typically for your toilet, 2-inch, which is common for your showers, and 1.5-inch pipe, which is common for your sinks. To the right of that image, you're going to see an OD SureFlow vent. We'll discuss what that is in some of these next slides. But basically, if you're having a hard time trying to find a way to vent one of your sinks, you may have a window right above it. This is a great way to do an in-cabinet vent. In the bottom left is a really unique product. It's actually called a toilevator. I said it, a toilevator. To the right of that, we see our shower pan. We do recommend installing the shower pan at this phase as well. Having the shower pan installed is just going to kind of set you up for success down the road. You do want to make sure you cover it up well, just so that as other trades are coming in, they don't dirty it up. So put something over the top of it, but it is helpful to have that installed. A couple final items on this page. The red and the blue lines there are the PEX lines. Those are your hot and your cold water lines. To the left of that is an insulation that can go over your PEX lines. And then you have a little example of just a clamp. Basically, as you're connecting your PEX lines together, we'll be kind of showing you a little bit more on that. And then the last thing, right now next to our logo, this is a really interesting product. Now, this is something that we kind of stumbled upon on accident. It's a green drain, it's called a green drain. Now, what this is if you are building out, say, a shower and you have really limited room in order to have a P-trap, this can actually replace that. So it basically allows water to flow through, but doesn't allow air to pass up. So I wanted to share that with you. That isn't something that I say I'd recommend. I think it's best just go with a P-trap. And we have ways that we'll show you on how we do that, but wanted you to be familiar with it. Next, the hot water heater options. So there's 3 most common options that we see people use. On the left there is a standard 120 volt electric hot water heater. That's a 19-gallon tank. We have used smaller tanks. Early on, we used to use a 6-gallon hot water heater, and it just really wasn't enough hot water. People, it was a lot of Airbnb rentals that we were doing, and people would be able to have about a 5-minute hot shower, and people just wanted something longer. So we switched to the 19-gallon, and that's been great. Gives you about 15 minutes of hot water, so it works really well. In the center, you have a propane hot water heater. This is great for off-grid applications. This is an on-demand hot water heater, which is nice as well. As soon as you turn on your hot water, you have it, and it's really an unlimited supply. So great product. And then on the right, it's a little bit of a unique hot water heater. It's actually a 12-volt hot water heater. It's made by Bosch. This one's a 4-gallon. They also have a 2.5-gallon. Now, if you're going with the 2.5-gallon, the pros and cons, right? So pros are it takes very little power. In terms of power consumption, hot water heaters typically do take a lot. And so on the spectrum there, this one would probably consume about 1,400 watts worth of power, which is good for a hot water heater. The downside is that a 2.5-gallon tank is going to give you about a 60-second hot shower. So this definitely is more for kind of like off-grid type situations where maybe it's more of a camping style or a hunting cabin or something along those lines. So those are the main options in terms of hot water heaters that we see people use. If you are looking to go off the grid, you do have options, right? You can connect to your on-site utilities, or you might be looking to put a container home in a really rural location. Maybe there isn't access to any city utilities, no water, power, and sewage. And you need to come up with some creative ways basically to manage that. And so in this image here, I'll go full screen with it. You can check it out. Top left is a 1,000-gallon water tank. Do recommend something along those lines in terms of sizing. If you go with a really small water tank, it just means people are going to have to come out more often to fill it up. So it's a little easier. Just make the upfront investment, get the large water tank, and it'll set you up for success long term. Then you have to the right of that, the water pump and the accumulator. Those go side by side. And essentially we'll take the water that's in the tank and pump it into your home, into all your fixtures. Bottom left, we have an example of a portable gray water tank. That's a pretty cool product. I would say this wouldn't be my first go-to in terms of the best way to handle gray water, but it is a solution if you just need to find a way to manage it. On the far right side is actually an example of an in-ground septic tank. This is usually going to be your best bet. All your gray and your black water can go in there. Gray water is basically any water that comes from your shower or your sink, and black water is anything that comes from your toilet. So when it comes to an off-grid type setup, typically the toughest thing to manage is the black water. And it's for that reason that a lot of people will go with off-grid toilets. Now, there's typically 3 different types of off-grid toilets you can go with. You can go with an incinerating toilet, a composting toilet, or the one we have here is a Laveo dry flush toilet. Some of the pros and cons. So incinerating toilet, really cool, really effective, but consumes a lot of power. Typically is going to require a 220 connection. So if you're off grid, could be difficult to go that route. Composting toilets are also a good off-grid option. Definitely something that would help manage the waste. I do like the Laveo dry flush toilet. It's a little bit of a cleaner setup. You'll have to look into more of the details of how it works. It's a little hard to explain, but basically there's these essentially foil bags that as you use the bathroom, you actually press and flush a button. The bag will actually twist, and it has so many uses in one large bag. So definitely an interesting little invention there. And then the last thing in this image you'll see to the left of the septic tank is just a propane tank. That's something that if you are going off grid, and you're not going to use an electric hot water heater, you want to have great hot water. Going propane is a great option for that. Now, when it comes to setup of plumbing, it really does depend on the final application for your container home. We see people do a lot of different setups. So you can see here the image in the top right is an RV unit. So it's a tiny home on wheels. It's a container that's mounted to a trailer. That would be something that gets plumbed a lot differently than some of these other examples. In the top left, essentially is a slab foundation where the plumbing was already pre-installed into the foundation. There are people that do container homes with this type of setup. The challenge is you have to perfectly line up where those plumbing lines are coming up as your container is being dropped in, and you have to have the cutouts in the right location for those pipes to then enter. So I can't say I'm the biggest fan of that setup, but it is an option that you can go with. Bottom left is a simple slab foundation. If you're doing something like this with a container home, typically you're going to need to keep all your plumbing of the container within the bottom structural frame of the container. So if you're familiar with a container, usually underneath the container, there's about a 6-inch space. And so you want to keep your plumbing in that space and then have it exit out one of the edges of the container for your connections into your sewage and your water. In the next slides, that'll become a little bit more clear as we'll show you an example of one that we're doing like that. And then the bottom right, probably the best option for someone that's doing a permitted unit that's going on a foundation. This is an example of more of a stem wall style foundation. This also applies if you're doing more of a pier style foundation, and really is nice because you have plenty of room under the container to run your plumbing. This means that you're not so concerned about trying to keep all your plumbing within the underside frame of the container. You have plenty of room to achieve the right slopes you need to make the connections. And ultimately, it can be done right there on site, even after the container is installed, because you can go underneath into the crawl space and run that plumbing. So pretty cool option there. Now jumping into kind of the step-by-step in terms of doing the plumbing. First, talking about mapping out your plumbing. So you do want to determine where your main water inlet location is going to be. This is typically going to be determined by where on your property you have access to the water. Same thing for the next point, which is sewage, right? So at the end of the day, if you have your water and sewage, let's just hypothetically say to the left of your container, you're going to want your water and sewage lines exiting on that side of the container. You don't want to have to run these lines out of the way, especially with the sewage line, where you are going to need to maintain a pitch or a slope of 1/4 inch per foot. So you want to keep that run nice and short. Next, you want to go ahead and map out all your plumbing fixtures in your container. To the right there, we have some details on what plumbing fixtures typically are common. So, typically it's going to be your shower, your vanity sink, your toilet, your kitchen sink, your hot water heater, your washing machine, maybe you have an exterior hose spigot, maybe even a couple, and then possibly even an ice machine in the kitchen. All those things are items that are going to require you running water lines too, and some of those drain lines as well. So you do want to map that out in your container as you're trying to navigate the best way to then run your drain lines, run your water lines, and connect them to each other. So that leads to that second to last point there, deciding how to route your water and drain lines. And then lastly, choosing where to run your vent lines. It's really important that all your plumbing is properly vented. Number two, when it comes to running your drain lines and your vent lines, we're going to start with just discussing the drain lines. So like I mentioned earlier, you do need to have a minimum slope of 1/4 inch per foot. And you do need to make sure that each fixture is installed with a proper trap. So if you're getting a toilet, already is going to include that built into the toilet. If you're installing your kitchen sink or your vanity sink, that's going to be right under your cabinet. Ultimately for the rough-in stage, you're just going to have your drain line stubbing out to the interior. After you install your cabinetry, you install your sink, you'll go ahead and include that, install that trap from your sink where it's draining and then into the drain that's stubbing out of the wall. So probably the most important thing in terms of having a proper P-trap is going to be the shower. Now, this can be a little bit difficult to achieve, especially if you don't have a lot of room under your container to play around with, right? If you're going on a slab foundation and ultimately you just have about 6 inches under your container to fit basically the P-trap and your proper pitches on your drain lines and your connections, basically a lot in a very small space. Now, in the past, we used to actually just raise our bathroom floors because of this. So we'd raise the entire bathroom floor about 6 inches just so that we can have enough room to properly run all of our drain lines and all of our plumbing. We have since gone away from that. That did cost a lot of extra money, took a lot of extra time. And ultimately, I wasn't a fan of it because if you did have a leak in your plumbing, it's really hard to fix it because it's buried under your bathroom floors. And so I like the idea of all the plumbing being underneath the container and having it more accessible. So similar to how we raise the toilet several inches with a toilet-vator, we do something very similar with the shower. Typically, we raise our shower about 3 to 4 inches. We'll basically just frame out with 2x4 a way to elevate that shower pan. And then it gives us more room underneath to create room for the P-trap, and ultimately for it to then go underneath the container, connect with the rest of the drainage, and then exit out one of the edges of the container. So I have a few images down here below that'll be a little bit helpful. And just kind of summarizing those final points there, in terms of sizes of drain lines, toilet average size, or toilet will be a 3-inch drain line. Shower washing machine will be a 2-inch drain line, and then your sinks will be 1.5-inch drain lines. And looking at these images, the one in the top right underneath our logo, you can see that shows you the function of a trap, right? It fills up with water. Ultimately, what this is going to do, it's going to prevent any bad smells or odors from the sewage coming back up through your shower drain or your sink drain. So obviously, this is really important. You don't want to finish out your bathroom and not have included a proper trap. And as a result, you're just going to have a really funky smell inside the unit. Now, looking at the images down at the very bottom, so starting on the bottom left, you can see that's actually underneath the container. That's the container rails, the metal structural pieces underneath. And you can see how all of our plumbing is tucked in right into that space on this particular unit. The second image in shows you an example of how you do have to run your plumbing through those metal structural pieces. So typically, best way to cut space for your plumbing lines is going to be with a plasma cutter. That makes the job really simple. If you do need to use a hole saw or something like that, it can be done. And so those are a couple different ways you can do it. The water lines are also ran underneath the container. Eventually, these are areas that may get insulated. You could potentially spray foam the underside of the container, things like that. The third image in, just kind of a little bit of example. You can see the water lines. These are not finished in this photo, but they're popping right through the wood framing there and into the underside of the container that's reflected on those left images. Same thing with the drain line. You can see the drain line popping right down through that floor as well. And then the final picture on the right, so all of our drain lines get connected under the container, and then they do typically exit in one 3-inch main sewage line. And then that's where you would connect to your septic tank or your on-site sewage. Now discussing a little bit about the vent lines, you can see in that bottom left image, this is actually for a washing machine. And so it has the drain line there. But then also you can see that black pipe running right up alongside the wood studs. That's actually the vent line. And you do need to have a vent for each one of your fixtures. The purpose of the vent is ultimately to allow that water flow to basically flow well through the drain. You don't want a situation where, an example would be like you get a straw, you put your finger on the top of the straw and you put it in a cup of water. As you pull it out, it's basically a suction, right? The water is staying in the straw. And that's what can happen if you don't have proper venting on your plumbing. So you want to make sure that every fixture, that's right, every fixture has proper venting. So you can see an example here in the middle. There are some situations where it's difficult to run a vent line up and through the roof or out the top of the container. A great example is a kitchen window. Might be right above your kitchen sink. And as a result, they do have inline vents. Basically, they can go under the cabinet and just allow that pipe to properly breathe and be able to create that flow of water. The bottom right image is an example of the rough-in stage of one of the vent lines exiting out that side of the container. Ultimately, we'll end up putting a 90-degree elbow on there and finishing it out, but just gives you an idea of what it can look like as you're in this stage of the rough-in. It's also common to exit out the roof of the container. We try to avoid that when we can, only because we don't want to create a bunch of penetrations in the roof that could lead to water leaks. So if you're adding a roof on top of the container, it does make it a little more simple. You can just go right through the top of that. And then on average, when it comes to vent lines, you're looking at about 1.5 to 2-inch lines. So transitioning to the water lines. Just kind of going through some of these bullet points here. Your shower, sinks, and washing machine will require a hot and a cold line, whereas your toilet is just going to need a cold line. As you're running your PEX lines, they're going to want to go right through the center of the studs. And similar to electrical, if it runs too close to the edge of a stud, you could always add a nail plate just to make sure no one eventually adds a screw that could penetrate one of the PEX lines. And then one thing that we really are a fan of is, as much as possible, the image in the bottom left, using those 90-degree brackets are great. I'm a huge fan of the plumbing lines as much as possible being a home run, meaning where that main connection is to the fixture, as much as possible, if it's able to be one shot without a bunch of clamps and crimps in between, it just ensures that, hey, this isn't going to have any issues with leaks. Whereas the more crimps you have and the more, times you're cutting that PEX line and putting a 90-degree on it, just more opportunity for leaks to happen. Of course, that's standard procedure. And if it's inspected properly, you're going to be fine, but just a personal preference there. And then you can see here the image at the very bottom, just an example of kind of mapping out how you're going to run those those hot and cold water lines. And those will then exit out the container to one main water line. Now that main water line will also connect to the hot water heater, and then all your hot water lines will run off of that hot water heater. A couple finishing touches that you're going to want to keep in mind. First one is insulating the water lines, especially if you're in a really cold climate. We did a container in Denver. We spray foamed it. We installed water lines basically in front of the spray foam, and we still had issues with freezing on one of the shower lines. And so this can be a great approach, is using some of these almost like heat wraps that can go over water lines, making sure they're really well insulated. It doesn't show it here, but I also, especially if your lines are exposed underneath the container, using spray foam could be a great option, right? Really sealing up all the way around those lines and making sure that they're just insulated really well. Lastly, you do want to seal all penetration. So anywhere those drain lines or water lines are exiting out through the bottom of the container, you can simply use like an OSI quad foam or any kind of foam or sealant product. Just seal up all those holes. Last thing you want is any critters, termites, ants, bugs, anything like that, just crawling back into your house and getting behind your walls. So want those properly sealed. Lastly, is the topic of testing your plumbing. And like we had mentioned at the beginning, you may not be the one performing all your plumbing work, but it is important that you make sure your plumbing work was done properly. Two different kind of areas you want to test for. First one is going to be your water lines. You want to check all your PEX fittings to make sure they're properly crimped. You can see the image in the bottom there, just an example of one that wasn't properly crimped. It could pop out and ultimately lead to some leaking. Another way of testing your water lines is to essentially fill all of your water lines, cap them, and then have them hold for 60 minutes. And you'll notice quickly if there's a leak, you'll see that water in that area. So lastly, with water lines, you can also do an air pressure test on the water lines, and you do want them to hold 80 PSI for 30 minutes. So essentially you'll cap off your lines and then run that test. And then basically after 30 minutes, you just want to make sure it's holding all that pressure. And if it is, then of course there isn't a leak and it's in good shape. Lastly, when it comes to your drain lines, we do encourage you to also test those. Sometimes you might think, oh, do I really need to test my drain lines and not the water that's leaving the unit? But ultimately there's situations where you could have a clog in a drain line, and the water is then going to come back up that drain. And you need to make sure that thing is actually 100% watertight, that when the connections were made, they were done really well. And so we do recommend basically capping off your main drain sewage exit, fill up those lines. Same thing with a shower. You can do a shower pan test where you fill up your shower pan with water, let it sit for 12 hours. And you just want to make sure those water levels do not go down. If you notice them going down, start looking around and try to identify where that leak could be coming from. Now with that, I just want to remind you, we do have that link in the description below for the free video training. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And coming up next, we got some good content for you. We'll be discussing electrical, and then we'll be diving into HVAC. And after that, be talking about your interior walls. And so a lot more good content coming ahead. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next video.